The 2014 Latakia offensive was a rebel offensive in the Latakia Governorate of Syria launched on March 21, 2014 by rebel Islamist groups including Al-Nusra Front, which called the offensive Anfal, while a coalition of Supreme Military Council rebel groups called the offensive the Martyrs Mothers. The objectives of the offensive have been stated to be the taking over of all strategic observatories, government villages and the Mediterranean coast. Observers have stated a strategic aim was to force the Syrian army to redeploy forces to Latakia, which would relieve pressure on other rebels elsewhere in Syria. They reportedly succeeded in this, with government forces being sent from Idlib, Hama and Aleppo to bolster defenses. During the offensive, the Syrian military was joined by Hezbollah, Iraqi Shi'ite militia and Iranian military advisors. After almost 2 months of fighting, the offensive stalled and eventually petered out, with rebels losing most of their early gains. However, the rebels' established strategic bridgehead consisting of the town of Kasab and nearby territory remained. By mid-June, a new advance by government forces recaptured the last rebel gains of the campaign, including Kasab. Background: the Armenians of Kasab were previously victims of Turkish violence during the Hamidian massacres, Adana massacres and the Armenian genocide, last two of which took place in the last century and involved the massacre of 2 million of Armenians. Syria and Lebanon researcher at Human Rights Watch and jihadist activist Lama Fakir had stated rebel groups had wanted to attack Kasab for a long time, but Turkey had previously denied them access. In the past the Turks refused to give us passage, because they said that in order to succeed in the attack we needed to be united, she said, referring to the battles that took place at the end of last year between the extremist Islamic State of Iraq and al-Sham, and other rebel groups in the area. Offensive, initial rebel advance. In the early hours of March 21, 2014, rebel fighters led by the Al-Nusra Front advanced from inside Turkish territory and attacked the Kasab border crossing with Turkey. The fighters reportedly crossed into Syria from the Turkish village of Gar Paragraphs Leka section Ila. Turkish MP Mehmet Ali Dipoglu, visiting the Turkish side of the border several days after the attack began, said locals told him that thousands of fighters coming from Turkey crossed the border at least 5 different points to launch the attack on Kasab. They initially managed to capture guard posts around the crossing but not the crossing itself. Rebel fighters also captured the nearby Al-Sakhra hill and a police station and directed mortar fire from the hill at the crossing and at the nearby Alawite village of Karzana, killing 5 people including a child. The leader of Al-Nusra for Latakia province was killed during the fighting. Rebels had also captured the Jabal al-Nis mountain, but it was recaptured by the military within hours. By March 22, the rebels managed to capture the Kasab crossing, while Kasab town remained under government control and fighting was still continuing around both of them. Government forces launched a counterattack in an attempt to recapture the crossing, and a security source stated the army had retaken the previous day 2 police stations that were seized by the rebels. According to the opposition activist group the SOHR, rebels at the crossing had been targeted by government troops since the previous day. In the meantime, rebels directed their attacks against a strategic hill known as Observatory 45, which they captured later in the day. Overall, the SOHR reported fighting in 3 government-held villages that were coming under a rebel attack and 3 rebel-held villages which the army was trying to capture. As fighting spread to other villages, the military responded with airstrikes and ambushes which left 20 rebels dead and 30 wounded around Observatory Kabar Solos. On March 23, Turkish Air Force F-16 jet fighters shot down a Syrian warplane as it bombed rebels fighting around the border post. The pilot ejected safely, according to a Syrian military spokesman, who also claimed that the plane was in Syrian airspace. Turkish officials, however, claimed it violated their airspace. Meanwhile, significant military reinforcements were sent to the border area. Rebels also launched a new attack against the village of Kabar Solos, about 25 kilometers south of Kasab. Opposition sources claim that over 20 soldiers surrendered to the rebels in the village of Nab al-Noor after a 3-hour siege on a building. Later during the day, government forces recaptured Observatory 45 and secured the village of al-Samra, while rebels captured the village of Al-Nabin and the surroundings of Jabal al-Nais, which forced the army to evacuate it. However, the rebels were not able to capture the top of Jabal al-Nais itself due to the army's control of Observatory 45, which is the highest point in the region and oversees Jabal al-Nais. During the day's fighting, the NDF commander of Latakia province, Hilal al-Assad, and 7 pro-government militiamen were killed in fighting in Kasab. According to the rebel Islamic Front, he was killed when they used Grad rockets to hit a scheduled meeting of pro-government militia leaders in Latakia city. On March 24, according to the SOHR, rebels were in control of the village of Kasab, after capturing the main square the previous day, with fighting continuing in the town's outskirts, specifically the hills outside the center of Kasab. However, according to a military source, neither side had control of the village and the situation was unclear. Rebel jihadists reportedly took Armenian families hostage in Kasab and desecrated the town's 3 Armenian churches. The army managed to recapture the town of Nab al-Mur. Meanwhile, Turkish media claimed the leader of the pro-government Syrian resistance militia, Mira Section Ural, had been killed the previous day. However, that evening Mira Section Ural posted a video on his Facebook account denying rumors of his death. Al Arabi television also claimed that 2 other cousins of Bashar al-Assad were killed in the fighting. According to Colonel Afif al-Suleimani, head of Idlib's rebel military council, the army withdrew many of its soldiers from Idlib province to reinforce their forces in Latakia province after the rebel offensive against the coastal area began. On March 25, rebels captured Al-Sanra and were reportedly advancing towards Anfal. A military source denied the village had fallen, stating that fighting was still ongoing and that the army was in complete control of the mountains overlooking Al-Sanra. Meanwhile, fighting was still raging at Kasab, with the army shelling the town and the Air Force striking it 4 times around noon. Later, a pro-government news agency claimed the army managed to recapture most of Kasab. According to the editor-in-chief of Aztec Daily, information warfare was being conducted and that it was too early to conclude whether government forces managed to regain control of the town, but confirmed fighting was ongoing. Rebels had also once again captured Observatory 45, after a Tunisian suicide bomber in an armored troop carrier blew himself up in the observatory's yard, killing a number of soldiers, including Colonel Samuel Ghanem, commander of Observatory 45. The fall of the observatory removed the threat of artillery strikes against Jabal al-Nais and the rebels were able to occupy its peak. Government troops from the hill retreated towards coastal Muf. Fighting around Observatory 45 continued. Meanwhile, the army recaptured Al-Nabin. 19 rebels and 16 soldiers were killed during the day's fighting and 40 soldiers and 100 rebels were wounded. The Turkish army accused the Syrian government of harassing 5 Turkish F-16 fighter jets with surface-to-air missile systems. The Turkish F-16s intercepted 4 Syrian aircraft approaching Turkish airspace in Yayladagi and Silvegazu of Hatay province in southern Turkey before the incident occurred. On March 26, rebels slowly pressed their advance from Observatory 45 and attacked the town of coastal Muf. Fighting had also renewed at Al-Nabin. The battle for both towns had been described as a seesaw one with both attacks and retreats. At the same time, fighting continued around Kasab, Observatory 45 and Al-Sanra as the army intensified its shelling on Kasab and Al-Sanra. The government mobilized thousands of soldiers and NDF fighters to retake the areas that had been lost to the rebels, and many government supporters, the majority of them Alawites, volunteered to fight against the rebels. A military officer claimed rebels had been pushed back from Observatory 45, but were still in nearby areas. Another source also confirmed that the army had beaten back the rebels from Observatory 45, but did not reoccupy it, instead securing the hills' surroundings. The military had also evacuated from Nab al-Mur, due to the town's vulnerability to rebel shelling from Observatory 45 and Jabal al-Nais. Pro-government sources claimed 500 rebels and 50 soldiers had been killed since the start of the offensive, while the SOHR stated around 100 fighters on each side had died. The Syrian government called on the United Nations to halt the Turkish involvement in the Kasab region. it accused the Turkish government for organizing, receiving, funding and hosting tens of thousands of terrorists from various Takfiri movements and facilitating their entry into the Syrian territories, and for providing the rebels with direct military support in the region. On March 27, several helicopter and airstrikes were conducted against Observatory 45, while Jabhat al-Nusra reinforcements arrived in the contested areas. Two pro-government sources reported the military managed to defend their positions at El Naban and coastal Malfand was advancing towards Kasab from the two towns. A pro-opposition source reported that rebels managed to capture Al Naban but that fighting was ongoing as the military was trying to recapture both it and Kasab. Another source reported that the military recaptured Al Naban after it received reinforcements from troops who evacuated Jabal al-Mais. Fighting was also still raging around Al-Samra. A pro-government newspaper also claimed another 200 rebel fighters had been killed in the last day. The military intelligence head in Latakia province was reportedly able to escape after he was surrounded by rebels for 5 days in Al-Nabin. By the end of this day, according to the SOHR, more than 150 pro-government fighters, including 14 officers, had been killed since the start of the offensive. On March 28, it was reported that the rebels had blocked several attempts by the Syrian army to send reinforcements to Latakia. On March 29, Al-Nabin was once again reported under rebel control, but with fighting continuing in its outskirts. Al-Ain TV claimed that 10 pro-government fighters were killed in an attempt by the army to recapture Observatory 45. It also reported the arrival of Hezbollah fighters in the area. According to a local activist, the FSA had set up a joint operations room under command of Brigadier General and FSA Chief of Staff Abdullah al-Bashir to support the rebel offensive. On March 30, the SOHR reported that several attempts by the army to retake areas in northern Latakia had been repelled by the rebels. However, the military was bringing more reinforcements from the coastal city of Tartus to try and stem the rebel advance. The battle for Observatory 45. By March 31, thousands of refugees reportedly fled to Latakia city, while a rising tension between the Armenian Christian Alawite community and the Turkmen community was reported. At this time, Barnabas Aid stated 80 Christian civilians were killed and thousands more displaced after rebel fighters captured Kasab. However, a delegation from the Armenian National Assembly visited and interviewed refugees from Kasab who fled to Latakia and concluded that fortunately, no casualties were reported on the Armenian side, though around 2,500 were displaced. According to the SOHR, 1,052 fighters from both sides had been killed and wounded since the start of the offensive. Among the dead were 27 army officers and 56 foreign rebel fighters. During the day, government forces made an attempt to advance towards Kasab as the rebel offensive started to stagnate and state TV made a live report from near the hilltop of Observatory 45 claiming the army had recaptured it. The SOHR confirmed the army made progress in the area and stated that government troops managed to install multiple rocket launcher on Observatory 45, but fighting was continuing in the vicinity of the hillside. Meanwhile, rebels hit the pro-government village of Baylaleh with 7 Grad missiles. Other pro-government villages were also shelled with mortars. The Turkish army stated that they had returned fire after mortar shells and a rocket struck areas near the town of Yeladagi. After midnight, government troops ambushed rebels in the forest around Observatory 45 resulting in a number of deaths among opposition fighters. On April 1, Ahmad Jabbar, head of the Syrian National Coalition, visited the front line in the Kasab region. The SOHR also denied state TV's claim that the army had recaptured Observatory 45, stating that clashes were still ongoing over the hilltop. On April 2, according to the SOHR, the rebels reached a perimeter of al-Badrousiya village where violent clashes took place amid new army reinforcements in that area. Opposition activists in Latakia claimed that the rebels repulsed an army attack on Observatory 45. During the fighting for the hill, the Moroccan leader of the Harakat Sham al-Islam rebel group, Ibrahim bin Shakran, was killed. A local rebel commander was also killed in other clashes, while dozens of bodies of pro-government fighters were reportedly bussed to the city of Tartus, according to opposition activists' claims. An opposition TV station also claimed that 11 Hezbollah fighters were captured in an ambush by rebels in the province, but this report could not be verified. On April 3, according to the SOHR, rebels managed to regain control over the buildings of Observatory 45 after they were captured by pro-government fighters during the night. At least 11 rebels were killed in the fighting, while at least 20 pro-government fighters were killed and wounded. But later activists reported that government forces, supported by the NDF, had managed to reach the peak of Observatory 45 and clashes ensued with opposition fighters, including Jabhat al-Nusra. The SOHR also updated the past day's rebel death toll to 20. On April 4, the SOHR reported that 64 rebels, including 40 foreign fighters, and 35 government soldiers were killed in fighting for Observatory 45 over the previous 2 days. 50 soldiers were also wounded, and among rebel fatalities, beside the leader of Harakat Sham al-Islam, was the group's Egyptian military commander, Abu Safia al-Masri. Fighting was continuing around Observatory 45 with mutual bombardment from both sides, while the Syrian army's chief of staff, General Ali Abdullah Ayour, visited government forces on top of the hill at the post. 8 rebels and 8 pro-government fighters were killed and 15 wounded in the fighting at Observatory 45. Meanwhile, the Turkish army fired shells into Syria, responding to 6 shells that landed in Yalad. Continued army advance. On April 5, after midnight, government troops ambushed rebels on the road towards Al-Nabin, resulting in a number of deaths among opposition fighters, while 2 Moroccan field commanders of Ara al-Sham were killed in fighting in Kasab. It was reported that Latakia city was hit by 2 Grad missiles during the day. On April 7, fighting erupted on the edges of the Jabal al-Haramiyah area with government forces advancing. The next day, Iranian press TV claimed the army had regained control of Jabal al-Haramiyah. On April 12, fighting erupted in Al-Nabin and Nab al-Mur, and later in the day clashes were still ongoing in the town's perimeters. The next day, the army recaptured Hama Mountain, near Kasab, while heavy clashes were still taking place near Observatory 45. By April 15, the FSA commander for Latakia province stated the offensive had stagnated after rebel forces had become exhausted due to the number of casualties they had endured and a shortage of ammunition. 3 days later, another opposition commander criticized the opposition Syrian National Coalition for not providing enough financial support for the offensive and supporting countries for not providing enough arms. Capture of Al-Samra and the Battle for the Hills. On April 27, government forces captured a guard post near Al-Samra, namely the town's police station, after an amphibious assault from the sea. As evening came, rebels had retreated from Al-Samra and government forces captured the village. The next day, the military secured Hama Mountain and engaged rebels on top of Tal al-Ama, while other government troops, including special forces from Al-Samra, advanced towards Al-Nabin. 4 soldiers were killed and 75 wounded by midday, while an unknown number of rebels also died. Government forces from Observatory 45 had also advanced, capturing Heights 724 north of the observatory. The army further captured Heights 959 and 1017. 2 days later, government forces were fighting rebels on Jabal al-Nis mountain, near Al-Nabin, and on 3 hills overlooking Kasab in an attempt to capture the hilly terrain before engaging opposition forces in the towns themselves. Later in the day, government troops fully secured Al-Samra and its surrounding hills. On May 3, government troops captured Radar Hill 1013 overlooking, and the next day fighting erupted in Al-Nabin. In mid-May, rebels reportedly recaptured Hills 53, 724 and 1013. As well as Syriat and Al-Nabin Hills. Opposition forces also attempted to capture Observatory 45, but failed. As of May 18, the offensive was considered to have petered out. Syrian army offensive rebel retreat. On June 12, the military started a new offensive and by the next day captured Hills 714, 767 and 803. On June 14, most rebels retreated from Kasab, while a few of them stayed to protect the retreating fighters. This came after the army took hold of areas that surround al-Nabin and advanced towards Kasab. The SOHR reported the military was moving towards nearby villages, including al-Nabin, while state TV already reported the capture of the town. SANA also stated two-thirds of Kasab were under military control. On June 15, the Syrian army took control of Kasab, its border crossing, al-Nabin and Nab al-Mur, fully reversing all opposition gains during the three-month campaign. Meanwhile, the army intensified its operations in the east of the province near Salma. Propaganda conflict. The offensive included the border town of Kasab and surrounding villages, which have significant ethnic minority populations. Kasab has a mostly ethnic Armenian population which for the most part fled the town as rebels advanced into it. This has led some to compare the displacement of Armenians during the offensive with the exodus that occurred during the Armenian genocide. The other surrounding villages were home to Turkmen who were also displaced during the fighting. During this time, there was an apparent reprisal killing of 2 Turkmen in Latakia. The role of Turkey in the opposition's advance was denied by Turkish officials. Armenians who were displaced during the fighting were provided aid by Turkey. In the weeks following the capture of Kasab, a propaganda conflict developed with pro-government sources claiming that rebels killed residents of the town and damaged local churches, while pro-opposition media claimed rebels helped some residents who were unable to flee the town and protected the local churches. During the propaganda war, rebel messages on the treatment of minorities were at times different, with mainstream rebels reassuring them, while other more radical jihadist groups described Alawites as apostates, and Christians were viewed as second-class citizens, according to a Shulman Ginsberg Fellow at the Middle East Forum. The Syrian Observatory for Human Rights Director Abdel Rahman stated that this confessional discourse engaged in by certain Islamist groups was taken advantage of by the Assad government to promote Alawite militia recruitment. Foreign reaction. Armenia Euro President Serzh Sergian made a press statement at the World Forum Convention Center in The Hague expressing his deep concern over the events in Kasab, remembering that the Armenian population of Kasab had experienced exile and deportation in April 1909 and in 1915, making a parallel with the 2014 situation. The third deportation of Kasab Armenians today is a serious challenge to ethnic minority rights protection mechanisms of the 21st century. He also thanked the Syrian authorities for the steps being taken to protect the Armenians in Kasab. A Canada Euro Andrew P. W. Bennett, Canadian ambassador to the Office of Religious Freedom stated, Canada is deeply concerned by the recent attacks by al-Qaeda-affiliated armed groups on the ancient Armenian town of Kasab in the Latakia district of northern Syria, during which Armenian churches were reportedly desecrated and Armenians driven from their homes. We stand determined that the perpetrators be brought to justice for such acts and to stem the rising tide of sectarian violence. A Nagorno-Karabakh Euro David Babayan, spokesman for the president of the Nagorno-Karabakh Republic, said that Turkey continues its anti-Armenian policy, in particular in Kasab, through subversive attacks. Turkey tries to make Armenians leave Syria and aims to liquidate the Armenian community of Syria. He also stated that while it would be preferable for Syrian Armenians to remain in Syria and preserve their communities there, Nagorno-Karabakh would be ready to accept and welcome any refugees. A Russia Euro Gennady Gatilov, Deputy Foreign Minister of Russia, condemned the attack on Kasab and the ethnic cleansing of Armenian Syrians in Latakia. He accused Turkey, the Western countries and the Persian Gulf states of supporting terrorism in Syria and called for an urgent meeting of the United Nations Security Council to discuss the situation. The UN Security Council declined Russia's meeting proposal at Chechnya. Euro Ramzan Kadyrov, head of the Chechen Republic, condemned the attack on Kasab and accused Turkey of assisting terrorists and expressed his condolences to the ethnic Armenian victims. He said, the official data says the attack on Kasab was carried out by al-Qaeda militants affiliated with the so-called Al-Nusra Front and Islamic Front. I am stating herein bindingly that these terrorists have nothing in common with Islam and cannot be called Muslims. Kadyrov also accused the US and European countries of remaining silent on the attack and accused NATO members of contributing to it. These terrorists have been reared, fostered and armed by the West and trained by secret services of NATO countries. They are fulfilling a task to ruin Syria and weaken the Islamic countries. A United States State Department deputy spokesperson Marie Harf stated during a press briefing on March 28, "We are deeply troubled by recent fighting and violence that is endangering the Armenian community in Kosovo, Syria and has forced many to flee. As we have said throughout this conflict, we deplore continued threats against Christians and other minorities in Syria." She ended adding, "The United States will continue its steadfast support to those affected by violence in Syria and throughout the region, including Syrian Armenians. We have long had concerns about the threat posed by violent extremists, and this latest threat to the Armenian community in Syria only underscores this further." The Congressional Armenia Caucus noted their concern in a letter to the President. See also 2013 Latakia Offensive, references.